If you choose to share your story, you're going to come across as pretentious, our professor told us. There's no two ways about it. Some people won't ever get it. Of course, you can choose not to talk about your story, but if you did that, what would have been the point of it all? And in a rare moment of oneness, hundreds of heads in that classroom nodded in unison. And I recall thinking, he's absolutely right. I could choose not to share this, but if I did that, what would have been the point of it all? It was late April 2004, the location somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. The space, a large gathering room on the SS Universe Explorer, a former cruise ship that had been converted into a floating university college campus, better known to my adventurers and me as simply home on the ship. I had just turned 20, and I was returning to the United States with 600 of my closest friends from a trip of a lifetime. The program is known as Semester at Sea. It's a study abroad program where college students are granted the opportunity to sail around the entire world in 3.5 months, roughly a semester's time, stopping in 9 different countries for a fully immersive educational environment. We took classes while on the ship in the middle of the oceans, so when we entered the countries, we were more than mere tourists. We were people eager to explore and to learn about the politics of Fidel Castro in Cuba. He said hello to us, by the way, and regaled us with a 4-hour-long speech without sitting down or taking a sip of water once. So I give him credit for that. We learned about and observed racial relations in Brazil, hunger and AIDS in South Africa, animals in Tanzania, religion in India, the culture of war in Vietnam, communism in China, political tension in Korea, bombs and beauty in Japan. It was an absolutely unbelievable experience. And in a way, that was the problem, because it was just that. It was completely unbelievable. And our professors and deans, more seasoned in the ways of culture shock than we were giving us a warning. To say that one has literally sailed around the world is unbelievably pretentious. It is deeply privileged, and it doesn't really stand up to a lot of criticism. But underneath all those experiences can emerge, if we are intentional, deep wisdoms that the world needs to hear. How are we called to remember the faces of those we meet along the way, the generosity and hospitality we experienced in these countries, and also the desperation that we saw in so many? How are we to keep a sense of humility about our ostentatious trip, while also boldly naming and claiming the truths that we learned, the truths that we had eaten and drunk and breathed and cried over in that time? How were we to integrate these surreal experiences into our being so that they become very real for us and for others? We have before us today a really rich passage that Grace read to us. There are so many places that we could go with this, and it holds within it one of my very favorite passages from all of the scriptures, the verse that says, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." I have preached on this passage more times than I can count. There is so much about being sent in those words, about being sent, about being intentional, about our call into the world. But this week, I was really struck by a different verse. And as I was thinking about Semester at Sea, it occurred to me that it is a similar quandary that the disciples experienced at the end of our scripture passage this morning, not the beginning passage I just quoted, but at the end. We're in week 2, where we're talking about the journey that Jesus was taking as he approached approach Jerusalem with the disciples. Today's passage starts with what I just quoted, Jesus sending out the disciples in pairs. He gives them instructions for the journey, specifically how to pack lightly, forget about checked luggage. Jesus is espousing not even bringing on a carry-on, but instead being entirely dependent upon the hosts that they encounter for what they need. And not planned hosts either, it seems. Essentially show up somewhere, and if you're welcomed, then bless that space. And if you're not, well, woe is to them, and continue on the journey. I spoke last week about how my husband Kevin prefers a more relaxed pace when on vacation, and Jesus would have agreed here. This is a wanderer story. It has a purpose in mind, sending out laborers to the harvest, but it does not have a set itinerary. More about that purpose in mind in just a second, but it's a wanderer story in keeping with those who prefer to kind of go where the day takes them. In Jesus' packing instructions, he is saying, don't make plans. Trust the flow of the Spirit and see where you are welcomed in. Some places will reject you. Forget them. They will reap what they sow in due time. Go where you are welcomed instead, because your message will be welcome there too. So when the disciples return, they're over the moon about what they've experienced and with what they can now do. Even the demons submit to us. There is spiritual strength in a group of willing souls who come together with openness to do a new thing. This is the verse that stuck out at me and why I shared about semester at sea and my professor's warnings and encouragement. Because this is actually one of the rare moments in the scriptures where Jesus rejoices at a group's actions. He is often complaining about the disciples, telling them they don't get it, trying to teach them something new. But here he rejoices at what they understand. That's really unique. Sometimes we see him marvel at an individual's faith, but rarely is he as jubilant by a collective effort than he is here. He pulls the disciples aside from the 72 and ends this story by telling them privately, you are so blessed to be experiencing this. So many prophets and kings have wanted to see and hear what you have seen and heard, but have not been able to. Treasure this. Treasure this. It was the same feeling I had when concluding my time on semester at sea. It was a blessed experience. I still treasure the time I explored the Iguazu Falls in South America, the largest waterfall system in the whole world. I still treasure in my heart the story of a homeless boy in South Africa who could have used his knife on me, the one he carried in his lone shoe in order to stay alive, but he chose a different path that night. I still treasure how my breath caught in my throat upon seeing Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for so long. I still treasure how my breath caught in a different way the first time I saw giraffes and gazelles and lions in their native habitats. I still treasure the shocking vistas of the Taj Mahal and the Great Wall of China and the resurrected city of Hiroshima. I particularly treasure the shining eyes of a certain girl in India as the greatest gift I have ever received this side of heaven. I treasure these things. And I'm sure all of you have similar treasures from your travels, either abroad or simply by living your life. We have all traveled a ways in our sea of humanity, experiencing different forms of beauty. We have experienced deep love from God, if from no one else, and that makes us very blessed indeed. But how do we share that story? How do we share these blessings? We are in some ways like the 12 disciples. Jesus pulls aside and marvels at and says, you are so blessed. You have seen and heard something very unique. And they are the same disciples he has sent out to share that story. But these blessings, talking about God, can seem rather pretentious to talk about. It's a pretty big conversation stopper to be able to talk about the hospitality that a homeless child offered me in India. And that pales in comparison to demons submitting to the disciples. And even that pales in comparison to hearing stories of how God has worked in our lives. And yet we're in our sermon series about Topsy-Turvy church, right? And this is the topsy-turvy part. We can't not talk about the goodness and the power of God. The disciples in Luke 10 had a wanderer's mission, but always with a purpose in mind. And that purpose is rooted in the understanding that blessings are not best kept to ourselves. Blessings, by their very nature, are meant to be shared. We are called to tell the stories of our faith as a church. This may call to mind the word testimony, which has been a word co-opted by some Christian folk with the intent of conversion in mind. But Jesus, I am convinced, was heartily unconcerned with the idea of conversion. What he was concerned about was making disciples. Disciple, you may remember, means learner in Greek. Jesus wanted to cultivate lifelong learners. What do we learn better from? A lecture or a one-time decision? Or stories shared over and over until we know them in our souls, such that we can pass them on down to others. Like that story you hear from your grandparents about their grandparents, and that story that becomes part of your very being that you pass on to your children and your grandchildren. When Jesus sent the 72 out, that was their call. Just share the story. And it is ours today as well. Even if the words stick in our throat, even if we're worried about how it's going to sound, talking about God in this day and age to various people in our lives, because everyone has an idea of what God is. Everyone has an idea about what a 3.5-month-long trip is. But when we tell the stories, they become alive in a different way. No, we don't mean the God who is very concerned with whether you attend church every Sunday or not. Yes, we do mean the God who calls us to put a pride flag out on our building, who calls us to welcome people just as they are, exactly for whom they are created to be. We are people who worship a really unique God. And that story deserves to be told. Even if it sounds pretentious, even if it sounds unbelievable and too good to be true. Because for the few that welcome our words and our actions, for the few who dare to believe it, it will change their lives. Telling the story need not be done on a street corner. It can be done as we offer gentle words to a hurting friend, as we show up with a tray of food to a family who's grieving. It can be done as we speak up in favor of kindness in the boardroom. It can be done as we march for a cause near and dear to us. It can be done as we grab some of the church's new business cards, which, by the way, are back that way, to be able to share with someone who might need to hear about us. It can be done as we tell the friend who doesn't believe in God, not that they're wrong, but what God's love has done for us. Beloved of God, as you journey onward this summer, as we continue in our sermon series about travels this summer, I invite you to take your church with you. Take your story with you. Share it with those who you think just might need to hear it. Maybe this summer, God will bring you to that place or to that person where you are called to be, to make an impact. If so, I would love to hear about it. Come back and bring your stories back with you. And maybe this won't bear fruit. As Jesus warned, and as the disciples learned, some people will never get how God's presence can transform their lives, and that's okay. It is not our job to save people. Here, Jesus tells the disciples, sow the seed and move on if it doesn't take root. The impact is God's to make. Our job is simply to be willing to be present, to share the story of how we have been cared for in our lives. In the words of my professor nearly 20 years ago, of course, you can choose not to talk about it. But if you did that, what would have been the point of it all? What indeed? May we all treasure our blessings, the blessing of our journey, so that we can in turn be a blessing for others on theirs. In the name of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit.